First, I would like to greet each and every person following this reflection on the developments and challenges of synodality in Latin America. In fact, the theme of synodality gains in urgency and relevance at this moment of the Church. It is linked to many possibilities of definitions and perceptions, since, strictly speaking, it is not just about journeying together. We've always done this since the first communities were set up. The richness of synodality is not just a concept, but a process that was formally initiated with the invitation to prepare to the Synod in 2023, which began in the year of 2021. Therefore, to affirm synodality and to state we're synodal is not simply to fulfill another task within the Church. It is not a deliberate choice to be or not to be synodal, but rather a constituent part of the Christian being that it is in the Church. It is a process that does not end at the end of the Synod or has a specific date to end. But I would venture to say that synodality is a constant construction of an awareness of this new way of being Church. It is a process that will be permanent within the ecclesial set. In Latin America, at this time, a book resulting from the first Ecclesial Assembly of Latin America and the Caribbean held in Mexico in November of 2021 was just published with the title Toward a Synodal Church Going Forward into the Periphery, Reflections and Proposals from this Assembly. It is interesting to think that even though it is not a step strictly linked to the Latin America synodal process, this assembly was and became a great exercise in dialogue and mutual listening, which is why we highlight it in quotation marks as a first step towards this synodal process. So, contrary to other SILAM documents, this was not an Episcopal conference or an Episcopal assembly, but it was an ecclesial assembly, meaning it involved all ecclesial agents in this debate and in this discussion. And it was open, and indeed it was carried out by all ecclesial agents. So unlike other documents of SILAM, the findings of this assembly never intended to be a conclusive document or intended to somehow give a closing to the reflection on the subject of synodality, right? Since synodality touches a movement in the history of the Church, that it is in human history and directly touches the forms or the way in which the Church is building in this dynamic to respond to new demands. In this sense, as an ecclesial assembly in text, we see how these developments are reflected. Developments carried out by almost everyone and by almost 100 working groups composed of lay people, religious men and women, priests, deacons, and bishops. However, it is worth mentioning that the deepening of the dialogue and listening in this assembly has not effectively advanced to the items of participation in decision-making and co-responsibility processes in the ecclesial process. And from my point of view, this participation in decision-making processes and co-responsibility in the ecclesial process are almost the fate of this synodal process. This process of listening, dialogue, must effectively lead to establishing new practices that go through these two elements. Strictly speaking, in relation to the synodal process that is in the listening at its listening stage that we end in September of this year, 2022, in the various churches and local churches, guided by the working document, The local churches organized themselves so that their participants could express their opinions. Certainly, in many cases, it was not possible to carry out a process of listening, strictly speaking, but rather a process of research on the various demands, suggestions, criticisms, propositions for the construction of a more synodal church. In any case, in general, a profile beyond the demands and suggestion of those that make up our communities can be traced from this process. This is the first step in the synodal process, understanding who we are, strictly speaking. The richness of our personal, cultural, linguistic, broader religious perception differences are and should be present in the result of this process. Beyond the communities, dioceses, and General Secretariat, the General Secretariat of the Synod is open to listening to other working groups that are also motivated to contribute to this historic moment of the Church. For this, they also receive suggestions from specific groups such as ecclesial observatories, church-linked entities, and other Christian and non-Christian denominations from an ecumenical perspective and interreligious dialogue that wish to propose their views, new paths, and new perspectives. Just like in the Latin American Assembly, from the compilation of this data, in the listening stage, the rise of elements that express critically from the experiences lived, a renewal of consciousness of each ecclesial individual who seeks ways of complementarity, which suggests that each social function is important, but that allows the realization of the social place of each participant in the ecclesial community. And then, what would the challenges be? The challenges are presented, from my point of view, in two stages that are intrinsically linked. The first one being overcoming the structural ecclesial challenges that we have solidified and consolidated, which must also need to be transformed by this synodal process. And the second, the overcoming of personal challenges and the openness and acceptance to this exercise of synodality. It is to say, to move from the stage of listening and dialogue to effectively generate mechanisms of relationships that generate the effective participation of all ecclesial agents, especially participation in decisions, the awareness that we are all co-responsible for the dynamisms of the Church and for the Church, the face of the Church in the world. To have this final advance of ecclesial communion, let us therefore set ourselves on our way to these challenges. Thank you very much.
Obrigada.